The Ottoman Empire was not just another kingdom that rose and fell on the edge of Europe. It was a state that began as a small Anatolian power around 1300 under Osman I, expanded into the Balkans by the mid-14th century, shattered the Byzantine Empire in 1453, reached its imperial peak under Süleyman the Magnificent, and survived until 1922, when the sultanate was abolished and the empire finally ended. At its height, Ottoman rule stretched from southeastern Europe to the gates of Vienna, across the Middle East, down into North Africa, and deep into the Arabian Peninsula. To understand the Ottoman story, you have to begin on a frontier. Osman I was a Turkish Muslim prince in Bithynia, in northwestern Anatolia, who built his power from neighboring lands once controlled by the Seljuk dynasty. What started as a regional beylik, or principality, became a ruling line that would last for centuries. The empire's earliest growth was shaped by movement, warfare, and political opportunity, and by 1345 Ottoman troops were already pushing into Europe through Balkans. In other words, the Ottomans did not rise in one sudden leap. They grew step by step from a borderland force into a serious regional power. The 14th and early 15th centuries were decisive. The Ottomans suffered a major setback in 1402 when Timur defeated them, but the dynasty survived, regrouped, and returned stronger. By the time Mehmed II came to the throne, the Ottomans were no longer simply a frontier principality. They were ready to become an empire with a true imperial capital, imperial institutions, and an imperial mission. That transformation is one of the great turning points in world history, because it marked the moment the Ottoman state stopped being a regional contender and became a civilizational power. Then came 1453. Mehmed II conquered Constantinople after a 55-day siege, breaching the ancient walls with cannon fire and ending the Byzantine Empire for good. This was not just the capture of a city. It was a seizure of one of the most important strategic, commercial, and symbolic centers in the world. Constantinople, later Istanbul, became the Ottoman capital, and from there the empire projected power into Europe, the Eastern Mediterranean, and the Islamic world. If you want the single event that transformed the Ottomans from powerful rulers into world historical empire builders, this is it. Mehmed II did more than conquer a city. He reshaped the state itself. Britannica describes the Ottoman system under him as one in which the ruling class became tied directly to the Sultan's will, and positions in government and the army were bound to service rather than independent nobility. The Devshirme system, in which Christian youths from Balkan provinces were taken, converted to Islam, and trained for military or administrative service, helped produce the Janissary Corps, which became the empire's elite standing army. This is one reason the Ottomans were so resilient. They built a highly centralized political machine that could mobilize talent, obedience, and force in a way many neighboring states could not. The Ottoman Empire was also famous for its system of managing diversity. Within the empire, millets were autonomous religious communities, usually organized around Christian and Jewish minorities, each led by a religious head responsible to the central government for taxes and internal order. Alongside that structure, guilds regulated economic life in towns and cities, setting standards for prices and quality. This was not modern equality, and it was not freedom in the contemporary sense, but it was an imperial framework that allowed many communities to live under one political umbrella while preserving a degree of local identity and internal organization. The next great leap came under Suleiman. In only a short reign, he extended Ottoman power into Syria, Egypt, Palestine, and Hijaz, and raised the Ottomans to leadership of the Muslim world. The conquest of the Mamluk Sultanate in 1516 to 1517 was a geopolitical earthquake, because the Mamluks had ruled Egypt and Syria for centuries and had made Egypt a major center of the Arabic-speaking Muslim world. With this victory, the Ottomans inherited both territory and prestige, and they moved into the center of Islamic power politics. Then came Süleyman I, remembered in Europe as the Magnificent, and among the Ottomans as the Lawgiver. His reign from 1520 to 1566 is widely treated as the peak of Ottoman power and wealth. Under him, the empire reached its classical form and made major gains in both the East and the West. Belgrade fell in 1521. The Hungarians were crushed at Mohacs in 1526, and Ottoman forces even besieged Vienna in 1529, though they failed to take it because supplying such a large army so far from the imperial center was extremely difficult. In the East, Suleiman also fought the Safavids, expanded Ottoman control in Iraq and around Lake Van, and secured Ottoman influence in the wider Islamic world. Suleiman's age is often called the Golden Age of Ottoman history, and for good reason. Britannica notes that the conquest of the Arab world had doubled treasury revenues, while the empire's administrative and military structures were functioning at a level of sophistication that made Ottoman power feel almost unstoppable. But there is an important nuance here. Even at its peak, the empire was already laying down tensions that would matter later. A vast military system, a demanding court culture, and an expanding imperial bureaucracy all made the state strong, but they also made it expensive and vulnerable to shifts in warfare, succession, and politics. Empire, in other words, always contains the seeds of adaptation and strain inside its greatest achievements. By the late 17th century, the Ottomans were no longer expanding in the same way. The failed siege of Vienna in 1683 marked the beginning of the end of Ottoman domination in Eastern Europe. After that, the empire entered a long period of intermittent war and retreat, facing a series of treaties that steadily cut back its reach. Britannica links this era to the Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699, later treaties such as Passarowitz, Cajamarca, and Jassy, an overall shift in which the empire remained powerful enough to survive, but not strong enough to reverse the strategic trend. This was not immediate collapse. It was a long, grinding erosion of imperial dominance. Even in decline, the empire changed. In 1727, Turkish-language books were printed for the first time in the empire by Ibrahim Mutafarrika, a symbolic moment in Ottoman intellectual and administrative modernization. The 18th century was a period of pressure, but it was also a period of imperfect adaptation, because the Ottomans were trying to respond to a new Europe of reorganized armies, expanding trade, and faster state institutions. That larger truth matters. Ottoman history is not simply a story of glory followed by decay. It is a story of repeated reinvention under pressure. The early 19th century brought the empire to a dangerous crossroads. In 1808, reformers in the bureaucracy regained influence with support from provincial leaders. Mahmud II was installed, and the state began another round of centralization. But resistance was fierce. The Janissaries remained a major political force, and conservative reaction repeatedly disrupted reform. Britannica describes the situation at the end of 1808 as desperate. Central authority was weak. North Africa was slipping away. Egypt was becoming semi-independent under Muhammad Ali, and local powers in places like Iraq and Syria were only loosely tied to Istanbul. This was the age of the Tanzimat reforms. Between 1839 and 1876, Ottoman rulers, such as Abdülmecid I and Abdulaziz, issued reforms meant to modernize the empire and reorganize it on more centralized, state-driven lines. The best known of these were the Hadi Serif of Gulhain in 1839 and the Hadi Humayun in 1856. The goal was to strengthen the empire by standardizing law, administration, and citizenship, while responding to the enormous pressure of Europe's great powers. The Tanzimat did modernize parts of the state, but it also exposed a painful contradiction. Reform was necessary precisely because the old imperial system could no longer do everything it once had. Then came the Young Turks, one of the most important political movements in late Ottoman history. Emerging from distant reform circles, they pushed back against the authoritarian rule of Abdülhamid II and helped force the restoration of constitutional government. The Young Turk Revolution of 1908 restored the constitution and parliament, and the movement then promoted modernization, industrialization, secularization, and Turkish nationalism. But the same movement that tried to save the empire also accelerated its transformation because its politics sharpened the tensions between empire, nation, and central authority. The years before World War I were catastrophic. In 1908, Austria-Hungary annexed Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Bulgaria declared independence. Then the Balkan Wars of 1912-13 stripped the Ottomans of almost all their remaining European possessions. Britannica notes that the empire lost more than 4/5 of its European territory and more than 2/3 of its European population. This was a civilizational blow. The Ottoman state still existed, but its old imperial geography had been shredded. The empire had become much smaller, more vulnerable, and much more desperate. In World War I, the Ottoman leadership made a fateful choice. The empire entered the war after calculations of advantage, German influence, and conflict with the Entente powers pushed the state into the Central Powers camp. Ottoman armies fought on multiple fronts: Anatolia, the Caucasus, Mesopotamia, Syria, Palestine, and the Dardanelles. During the war, the Young Turk regime also abolished the capitulations, suppressed Arab nationalist leaders, and carried out the mass deportation and killing of Armenians in eastern Anatolia and Cilicia. Britannica notes that these events are widely described as genocide. By 1918, military exhaustion and internal collapse had brought the state to the edge of destruction. The post-war settlement was brutal. The Armistice of Mudros in 1918 ended Ottoman fighting, and the Treaty of Sèvres in 1920 went even further, stripping the Ottomans of the Arab provinces, internationalizing the Straits, and placing severe controls on Ottoman finance and territory. But the treaty did not become the final word. Turkish nationalist resistance, led by Mustafa Kemal, overturned the settlement in practice, and the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923 recognized the sovereignty of the new Turkish state. The Ottoman sultanate had already been abolished in 1922, and the empire's long political life was over. The history of the Ottoman Empire is the history of transformation. It began as a frontier principality, became an imperial superpower, built a complex system of administration and religious coexistence, fought the great wars of Europe and the Middle East, and then struggled to survive in a modern world that was moving faster than any sultan could control. It is tempting to tell the story as a simple rise and fall, but the real Ottoman story is more interesting than that. It is a story of endurance, reinvention, contradiction, and extraordinary historical reach. More than 6 centuries after Osman I, the empire's shadow still stretches across the modern Balkans, Turkey, the Middle East, and North Africa. That is not just the history of a dynasty. It is the history of a world.